All right, welcome. Um, I know many of you, but not all, and I just want to welcome everyone to this study session. I'm Rabbi Micah Streiffer, and I'm the director of La Asok. La Asok is, all of you know because you're here, a liberal Beit Midrash. It's a place to come together to study our texts in a progressive and egalitarian and inclusive environment. And I'm really excited to be able to spend this next hour studying the book of Ruth with you. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to say the blessing for study together. If you would like to join me, you can feel free to unmute for the moment and we'll say the blessing together. Beyond this, I'm going to ask you to stay muted. There will be times when we can share thoughts and things like that, some of which we'll do in the chat, some of which we'll do by unmuting, but I would ask you in general, there's a lot of us, so if you'd like to speak, if you have a thought to share, just raise your hand electronically or just wave at me frantically and I will call on you. That way everybody who wants to gets a chance to speak. So let's say the blessing for study together, and then we're going to talk about Ruth as a symbol of hope. Baruch atah Adonai
Eloheinu melech haolam kishanu b'mitzvotav Torah.
Blessed is the one whose mitzvot make our lives holy and who commands us to immerse ourselves, to engage ourselves in words of Torah. So let me ask you to do a little thought experiment with me, a little word association here. What words come to mind or ideas come to mind when I say Ruth? Just put them into the chat. What words, what thoughts, what ideas come to mind when we talk about the biblical Ruth? Just going to give it a minute for the words to come up here. Lots of words. People have lots of associations with Ruth here. I love this. I want to explore every one of these, but we won't have time, so we'll have to come back and do that another time soon. So I see a number of references here to conversion. I see several references to things like faith or faithfulness, faithful daughter-in-law, devoted, loving kindness. That'll come up in our discussion today. And I see dedication, courageous. I'd love to know more about courageous grieving at a later point. Somebody quoted that famous passage from Ruth, which we'll look at in a moment. Your people are my people. And I see, and again, more words about conversion and loyalty and dedication and love. So we have strong emotional reactions when it comes to Ruth. Ruth is a book that occurs on an emotional human level. Some of what happens, especially in various parts of the Torah, is happening on a geopolitical level. We're reading, not the Torah, the Bible. We're reading about King David and his machinations with the various other kings. Sometimes we're even reading about Abraham and how he deals with other kings and makes treaties and things like that. When it comes to Ruth, Ruth is occurring very much on the interpersonal level. Ruth is occurring very much on the person-to-person level. And when we think about Ruth as a symbol of hope, which is our topic for today, it's very possible that some of that is because this is such a human book. So I'm going to share my screen here and we'll do a little bit of background. First, who is Ruth and what is Ruth? We have here on your screen a beautiful painting by Merla, which is called Ruth in the Fields. And that image of Ruth holding the grains of wheat, which is in a minute we'll see what that's all about, is a really common image of Ruth. And okay, so what is the book of Ruth? What are we reading here, and what's the overall arc of the story of the book of Ruth? We're going to read 3 snippets of this book over the next hour and try to understand where is the hope, where is the tikvah in the book of Ruth. Also, fun fact, I learned this after I decided to teach this class, that the book of Ruth is the first place in the Tanakh, in the Bible, that actually uses the word tikvah, the word hope, and we'll see that in just a moment. So in chapter 1 of Ruth, we are introduced to Naomi. Naomi is an Israelite woman who moves to the land of Moab. Moab is across the river in what today is Jordan. And so she's left her people. She and her husband have left their people, the Israelites, and settled there. And then, as we'll see, Naomi's husband and her 2 sons die. So she is left with her 2 daughters-in-law. She tries to send her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, home. And as we'll see, Orpah tearfully decides to go home, but Ruth stays with Naomi. In chapter 2 of the book of Ruth, Ruth and Naomi come home and need to make a living somehow. So Ruth goes to glean at the field of a man named Boaz. Boaz is a relative of theirs and a potential redeemer. We'll talk more about what this word means, but a redeemer here means essentially someone who can take them in, potentially through marriage, and give them a place within the social framework of the ancient of the Israelite world that they're living in. Boaz speaks kindly to her, and we will look at that passage as well. Chapter 3 of Ruth, Ruth goes to Boaz at the threshing floor when he's busy threshing his wheat during the wheat harvest. She boldly asks him to marry her, which is relatively unheard of in the ancient world. He is blown away by her kindness and agrees, pending the one relative who's a closer relation who would have essentially a first claim on taking in Ruth and marrying her. Finally, in chapter 4, the unnamed redeemer we were just talking about, that person who's a closer relation, opts not to take on Ruth and the property that comes along with her, which we only learn about in chapter 4. So Boaz marries her, and this is obviously my little summary here. Boaz marries her, and they live happily ever after, and they have a baby named Oved, who is the grandfather of King David. We learn in a little addendum at the end. We also get an addendum from Peretz, who's the son of Judah and Tamar back in Genesis, all the way down to David via Boaz. So we've learned that King David is descendant of both Ruth and Boaz, and that ultimately is the addendum or the conclusion of the book. So that's the overall arc of the book that we're looking at here. It's a very short book, only 4 chapters. It takes place ostensibly in a very early time in Israelite history, during the period of the judges, before there's kings, before there's before there's David, before there's the United Kingdom or the divided kingdom. This period of the judges, which is in many ways sort of lost to the mists of time, which is understood as a time of less organized society, a time of chaos. And as you might have noticed, this is in many ways a story about women. It tells the story of these 2 women who have to struggle for survival in a world where their husbands have died and they have been left alone. So let me now ask you, and we can do this by either through the chat or by raising your hand if you have a thought. Why do we read this on Shavuot? What do you suppose is the connection between this book that I just outlined and the holiday that we're now celebrating? And again, feel free to either put it in the chat or to raise your hand if you have a thought. I see Joy and Peter. Go ahead, Vanix.
It's all about the threshing and the gleaning and threshing, which is the harvest, the wheat harvest, and Shavuot is the harvest festival when the grain is harvested.
Okay.
And that predates the reassigning of the holiday to the giving of Torah at Sinai.
Okay, so Shavuot has 2 meanings, right? The original meaning of Shavuot is this harvest festival. It's the springtime harvest. It follows 7 weeks after Pesach. And so Ruth is clearly, there's an association with harvesting. We saw Ruth go out and harvest in the fields. We see Ruth go during the threshing season to meet with Boaz. And several other people put something like that into the chat as well. But I also see a couple of comments from Ellen and from River that this also relates to the Torah aspect of Shavuot. Shavuot is also, of course, the holiday of the giving of Torah. And Ruth, as a, well, the Torah, the Tanakh never uses the word convert, right? There's no such thing as conversion in those times. But Ruth does declare her fidelity to the Jewish people, along with her fidelity to her mother-in-law and to the actual people that she's coming to live with. And so there's a sense that Ruth opts into Judaism in the way that all the Jews opt in when we receive Torah at Sinai, as Ellen put, receiving the Ten Commandments, and Ruth accepting Judaism, essentially being accepted and accepting the commandments as well. And River said the agreeing to the covenant. So I want to expand on this a little bit with the help of two biblical scholars, Dr. Tamara Cohen-Eskenazi of Hebrew Union College and Dr. Tikva Freimer-Kensky, who lists 6 different reasons why we read Ruth on Shavuot. And I'll just race through these so we can get to actually reading the book of Ruth here. So some of these we already said. Both the Torah and Ruth are about kindness and generosity, and we'll see this come up, the notion of chesed that comes up in the book. The notion that at Sinai, Israel took upon itself obedience to Torah or accepting of Torah, and Ruth does the same thing. According to one tradition, David was born and died on Shavuot. The book of Ruth ends with the lineage of David. I would suggest it's probably the other way around. Let's be honest. The story that King David was born and died on Shavuot probably follows the fact that Ruth is associated with Shavuot, but that's my theory. The harvest, the notion that we raised that Shavuot is associated with the barley harvest, and so too is the story of Ruth. A midrash, teaching from rabbinic literature, claims that Torah can be adequately grasped only by those who have suffered. Ruth suffers poverty and hardship. So there's a notion that somehow Ruth is an archetype for what it means to grasp Torah, because Torah can be understood only fully by those who have suffered in life. That's very interesting. And finally, from the Hasidic master, the Sfat Emet, he offers several additional explanations. Reading Ruth teaches us that actions and not mere study are the essence of righteous living or goodness. Boaz exemplifies this teaching through his actions of chesed and his observance of mitzvot. And of course, the observance of mitzvot is central to Shavuot. Having received the Torah at Sinai, Israel is now ready to bring near anyone who seeks to receive it, including proselytes like Ruth. So Ruth is the natural next step of Sinai. Once Judaism exists, then anyone who wants to can opt in. The Torah helps Israel gather the holy sparks scattered among the nations, such is the case with Ruth. Ruth as a person of holiness who opts into Judaism. And finally, in taking the Torah upon themselves at Sinai, the Jewish people all became proselytes or converts. So is there really such a difference between the person who is born Jewish and the person who converts to Judaism? Aren't we all Jews by choice? The Sfat Emet suggests that Ruth is really the story of us all. So we have a lot of connections between Ruth and Shavuot. Why we really read this book on Shavuot, it's hard to say. We don't know. But all of these seem like plausible possibilities in terms of why this book is read on Shavuot. Let's now start at the beginning of the book of Ruth. And as we go through, I'd love to ask you to think about, where is the hope? Where is the tikva in this book? So it says, in the days when the chieftains ruled, and by the way, the Hebrew word chieftains here is the word shoftim. Shoftim actually means judges. And so we're talking here about the time of the book of Judges. Judges like Deborah and Gideon and Samson, who this is a time period when, rather than having a strong central monarchy, Israel is a diffuse set of tribes. And every once in a while, when something was going wrong, a judge would arise, a chieftain would arise and sort of like save the people, and then they would just keep going until the next one was needed. So this is not a time of strong central government, but rather sort of a time that's understood in Judaism as a time when everyone does what they please. There's a lot of there's a lot of disorganization, a lot of chaos in society during this time. And that's when this takes place. So in the days when the chieftains ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah, with his wife and 2 sons, went to reside in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the 2 sons were Machlon and Chilion, Ephraimites of Bethlehem in Judah. They came to the country of Moab and remained there. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Here's the introduction of Ruth into our book. Then those 2, Machlon and Chilion, also died. So the woman was left without her 2 sons and without her husband. Already in the first 5 verses of the book, this family has experienced incredible suffering, incredible trauma. Naomi and her husband Elimelech, is that his name? Elimelech, right? Yeah. I don't even know his name because he's not important to the book. Elimelech go to Moab. He dies. The sons get married. They die. And now in the first 5 books of the first 5 verses, they are already left quite alone. So we can already see that this is in many ways a book about women, because in the first 5 verses, all the men have died. And by the way, in case we weren't sure that that was the case, the names Machlon and Chilion essentially mean like sickness and nothingness, right? So they're already, from the very beginning, we know that they won't play a role. This is really a book about Ruth and Naomi. So let's ask another question here, which is, well, actually, no, we'll go on a little farther. So Naomi now starts out with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab. For in the country of Moab, she had heard that the Eternal had taken note of God's people and given them food. So actually, let me stop and ask my question here. What is Naomi's situation here? If you had to describe Naomi's situation, maybe somebody can raise their hand and tell us, how would you describe the predicament that Naomi is in right now? I see Vicky's hand. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, she's left alone. She's in poverty. She has no food. She doesn't have any alternative at this point than to go back to her people or to go back to Israel or whatever. She needs to have to leave and to find ways to support herself and to eat and that. So
Great.
I mean, it's really tragic. So
yeah,
I mean, having lived there for a long time to be in this situation, but it happens even in real life now.
Yeah, thank you, Vicky. So yeah, so there's a socioeconomic disaster happening here, and there's also a social disaster. Naomi has left a long time ago, and her entire world has just fallen apart. Her husband died, her sons died. She's left without her world, and she's left, as Robert put in the chat, destitute. And not only that, but the other thing we need to know is that in the ancient Israelite world, a woman's social status was tied to the men in her life, either her husband or her sons or her father, depending on what her status was. Was she a married woman or an unmarried woman or a widow? Naomi has none of the above. She has no father, no husband, and no sons. All she has is these 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. And so that is why when she sets out, the first thing she does is say to them, go home. So accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living, and they set out on the road back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, turn back, each of you, to her mother's house. May the Eternal deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and me. You don't want this, she says. We have nothing here. Go home to your parents. They can feed you. They can take care of you. Maybe they can even marry you off again. There you'll have a chance. What do I have to offer you? She's essentially resigning herself in a way to a life of of poverty and of social destitution because she has no social status. And I don't mean low social status. I mean that a woman with no husband, father, or son in this world was outside of the social status entirely. By the way, that's why the Torah tells us you need to take care of the widow, the poor, and the orphan. The widow is the woman who has no family network to take care of her. So Naomi says to her daughters-in-law, go home. I have nothing here for you. May the Eternal grant that each of you find security in the house of the husband. And she kissed them farewell. They broke into weeping and said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi says, turn back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I any more sons in my body who might be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight and also bore sons, should you wait for them to grow up? Should you on their account debar yourselves from marriage? Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of the Eternal has struck out against me. A couple more verses here, then we'll stop and talk about it. They broke into weeping again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law farewell, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, see, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. Go follow your sister-in-law. But Ruth replied, and here's the famous line, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Eternal do to me if anything but death parts me from you. And it essentially says when Naomi heard this, she couldn't argue. She has nothing to say to this powerful statement by Ruth. So let's stop here. Joy and Peter, I see your hand. Go ahead.
I'm wondering why, if there's a rule that says when a husband dies, the brother or the closest relative has to marry the widow, and Boaz is a relative, and I'm wondering why Boaz marries Ruth, other than maybe there's love in there. I'm not sure, but why does Boaz marry Ruth and not Naomi?
So hang on to that question, and we'll talk about the role of Boaz as we get a little further into this text, because that's where the notion of redemption comes in. So let's take a step back here, and what I want to ask you about is this verse right here, where Orpah goes home, but it says Verut davka bo. Ruth clung to her. And my question for us is, let's talk about Ruth right now. Why does Ruth stay? Let's try to put ourselves into the headspace of Ruth, into the shoes, the sandals of Ruth, and understand, why does Ruth stay? What do you suppose motivates her to cling to Naomi the way that she does here? And I see some in the chat, or if anybody has a comment, they can raise their hand as well. River, go ahead.
Does Ruth have, a family of origin to even go back to? Is there, if she doesn't have a family of origin to go back to, what does she have to lose by staying with Ruth, who I'm assuming has been kind to her throughout the years that she was married to her son, to even be like, okay, I'm going to take this risk and go with you?
Okay, good question. So of course the Tanakh doesn't say, although I think from Naomi's statement, go home to your mother's house, we can understand that Ruth does have a house to go back to, a home to go back to. We don't know anything about them. The Midrash says that Ruth was a princess of Moab. So Ruth, that makes it even a more exalted choice, right? She chooses to stay with Naomi rather than go home to the palace. The Tanakh doesn't say anything like that. But I think we can assume that she has somewhere to go, even though we don't know much about the somewhere. So I saw, is it Ebe? I saw Ebe's hand. go ahead and unmute, and then we'll go to Bob and then Demetra.
I was thinking that if it's possible, I mean, I don't know much, but I'm thinking if Naomi was very kind, had been very kind to Ruth, could it have been that Ruth wanted to stay with Naomi or other people like Naomi that she saw that they were kind? And if it was kindness, one of the reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Ruth seems motivated by kindness. We don't know a lot about Naomi's relationship with Ruth, but we do know a little bit about Ruth, right? We will learn later on that Ruth is motivated by kindness. And so this seems to be an act of kindness on her part as well. And perhaps she learned that from Naomi. And perhaps rather than going home to her family, whatever it was like, she chooses to throw in her lot in a place, in a family that is built on chesed. So I see Bob, Demetra, and then Susan.
I agree with this idea of kindness, and I also think that this is an important example of friendship, a very deep friendship, and friendship across generations in a way. David and Jonathan had a very close friendship, and of course you get into various ideas in our modern age about does that mean something more or not? But they were of the same generation, if you will. They were contemporaries. These women were separated in age, but it was a very close, loving and friendship relationship that was here, very deep. And I think that's an important aspect of this. And I see that as giving this a patina of hope.
I appreciate that comment, Bob. In fact, take a look at this commentary with me. This is from the Jewish Study Bible. It's a wonderful resource, by the way, where it points out that Ruth's attachment to Naomi is reminiscent of Genesis 2:24, which refers to the clinging, same word, davka, or dabek, clinging of husband to wife. The connotation here is not sexual, it says, but rather signifies Ruth's unswerving devotion to Naomi. So we have a very close bond of love between these two women. And so this act of staying with her is an act of love and devotion and commitment. So the word chesed, which means essentially loving kindness out of loyalty, is what comes up over and over again. So I see Demetra, and then Susan, and then Ira. And then I think we'll move on to the next text. Go ahead, Demetra.
Yeah, I did also want to bring up the word love, and I was curious if the word ahava, what context it's been used in the other parts of the Tanakh, and you know, whether it's the love of God towards the people or the love of people, you know, Am Yisrael, or towards God. But in this particular case, I just find it extremely personal, and it's more than friendship to me. It's real love. It's family. It's really family. I mean, not that you can't love your friends, but this is her family, and they've been through a lot together. And I feel like I feel like you could fairly infer from the text that Ruth loves her mother-in-law and loves her like a daughter loves a mother.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that comment. I agree. And I mean, in very brief to your question about ahava, which means love, the answer is that the biblical resonances of ahava have all the all the resonances of how we use love as well. So ahava can refer to love between two partners. It can also refer to love between parents and children, or love of God for us and us for God. And you can also use that word to say like, oh, I really love that drink, you know, or this, you know. So the word is very broad. And what comes up most of all here in Ruth is the notion of chesed, which is not exactly the same word as ahava. Chesed, we often translate as loving kindness, but it really means something like loving kindness out of loyalty or fidelity. We talk about in Judaism about gemilut chasadim. Some of you might know from Pirkei Avot, the passage that says the world stands on three things, on al haTorah, al ha'avodah, ve'al gemilut chasadim. The world stands on Torah, it stands on worship, and it stands on acts of loving kindness. That's what Gemilut Chasadim means, is an act performed out of love that is an act of loyalty or fidelity to someone, to another person. And that's what we're talking about here. Susan, go ahead, and you'll have to unmute, and then Ira. Oh, Susan, you're muted. Are you able to unmute there?
Okay, got it. Yeah, I think those were my thoughts exactly. I think Ruth came to love Naomi like a mother. It would be unthinkable for her to send her off on her own and understanding what she was facing. She, out of that love, she threw her lot in with her.
Mm-hmm.
And it was her heart's desire to be whatever support and help she could be instead with her.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that, Susan. And let's just notice that actually Naomi sends Ruth away for the same reason. Why does Naomi send Ruth away? Because she loves her and wants her to be taken care of. Why does
Right.
Ruth stay? Because she loves Naomi and wants her to be taken care of.
Ruth could not abide being taken care of while she knew Naomi was tossed to the wild on her own.
Mm-hmm. Yep, great. Ira, last word on this, and then I have another question.
This is just to build on what Susan and Demetra were saying. Is, one of the 10 Commandments is thou shalt honor thy mother and father. And, and when your parents get old, I think you're supposed to, it's an act of love and kindness to take care of them. And so to honor her husband, I mean, this is her mother-in-law. But on the other hand, if you have children and you're getting old and sick, you might, like you said, not want to burden them with your old age.
Mm-hmm.
But what she did was selfless, so.
Yeah, in fact, they both do something selfless here. One of them in sending the other away, and the other one in saying, no, I'm not going anywhere. They're both acts of selflessness. One more question about this. I mentioned that the word tikva, the word hope, appears in the book of Ruth, and it's right here. Naomi says, turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight and also bore sons, should you wait for them to grow up? In other words, what Naomi has to offer her daughters-in-law is the potential of future husbands, right? And she says, essentially, I have no hope. Even if I get married tonight, it's going to take 20 years before they can grow up. And I could, have a child in 9 months, and then 20 years later, you'd have a husband. There's no hope here, Naomi says. And my question for you is, it seems that Naomi has no hope. Why does Ruth have hope? What is the hope that Ruth has here? Any thoughts about that? I see Joy and Peter. And we'll keep these a little bit short if possible, because I want to look at least one more text. I see Joy and Peter, I see Carrie, and then I see Bob.
I think for Ruth, it's youth. I think youth has hope. And I think she also feels that by going forward's got to be better than where they are. So going forward will give them hope.
Yeah, so it's almost like a let's put one foot in front of the other kind of thing. And we're in this together. That's the other element I see there. We'll be in this together, and we'll kind of figure it out together. Carrie, go ahead.
So Ruth was married to her Jewish husband for 10 years. So either he converted to paganism or she somehow learned about Judaism. But the idea that the reins had come back to Judah means that whatever bad things that the people had done in Judah to displease Adonai, or they had returned to Adonai. So the reins came back. So that's very hopeful that maybe if she goes back to Judah and becomes, she'll gain all the favor that the other people of Judah have gotten because they've been faithful to Adonai.
Okay. Yeah, so if we leave here and go there, it's not unlike what Joy was saying. Let's go. Let's put one foot in front of the other and make our way there, because the hope is found, in a sense, in the willingness to move forward and to move forward together. And I'll just point out that Robert says in the chat that Ruth has faith in the unknown, which is really hard, really scary, that the faith here is somehow in her own capacity to be okay. That's where the hope is found. Bob, go ahead.
And expanding on that, I mean, when Abraham left his land and his father's house with the hope for some kind of a future, he needed to do it on God's command. Here, Ruth does it on her own motivation. And that's even more amazing.
Yeah, is Ruth here an archetype for the kind of hope that we would like to have be central to Jewish life? Okay, let's move on to a little bit of chapter 2 here. And we're not going to read all of it, but I want to focus in on one very important verse here. We'll read the first 12 verses. So now they're back in Judah. And yes, they're back in Judah. So now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a man of substance, meaning he was wealthy, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, I would like to go to the fields and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone who may show me kindness. Yes, daughter, go, she replied. So gleaning here, we're referring here to the institution of pe'ah, of leaving the corners of the field unreaped, so that the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger can come and reap. That's what Ruth is doing now. She's going to go to a field. She's going to gather some food, because built into this society is an institution that allows, or that provides, a little bit of food for those who are destitute. Naomi says, go. And off she went. She came and gleaned in a field behind the reapers, and as luck would have it, it was a piece of land belonging to Boaz, who was of Elimelech's family. The Hebrew, as luck would have it, here is Vaiker Mikre. In other words, it just so happened, is what it says. And the rabbis look at this and say, no, it didn't just so happen. This is where the rabbis see the hand of God working behind the scenes here, that God made this happen so that Ruth would come to the field of Boaz. Of course, the text doesn't say that at all, but that's how the rabbis understand the text. Presently, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. He greeted the reapers, the Eternal be with you. And they responded, and God bless you as well. By the way, a little bit reminiscent of this week's Torah portion, where what do the priests say to all of us? Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May God bless you and keep you. And you have here, Yivarechecha Adonai. So we see people blessing each other here. This is just a greeting, right? It's just a nice way to talk to people. But we see people conferring words of blessing on one another here. Boaz said to the servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose girl is that? The servant in charge of the reapers said, she's a Moabite girl who came back with Naomi from the land of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. She's been on her feet ever since this morning. She has rested but little in the hut. Boaz said to the Ruth, listen to me, daughter. And daughter here just means, like, it's a term of endearment. You know, he's speaking kindly to her. Don't go to glean in another field. Don't go elsewhere, but stay here close to my girls, the girls who are gleaning on behalf of his family. Keep your eyes on the field they are reaping and follow them. I have ordered the men not to molest you. And molest you here is not sexual. It means not to bother you, not to kick you out, not to send you away. And when you are thirsty, go to the jars and drink some of the water that the men have drawn. She prostrated herself with her face to the ground, and she said to him, why are you so kind as to single me out when I am a foreigner? Boaz said in reply, I have been told of all you did for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and the land of your birth and came to a people you had not known before. Yishalem Adonai ho'olecha. May Adonai reward your deeds. May you have full recompense from God, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have sought refuge. So what is the message of Boaz here? Why does Boaz treat Ruth with such kindness? According to him, it's because he understands that Ruth has been a person who acts with kindness. In other words, the kindness breeds kindness here. The chesed breeds chesed. Boaz is moved to behave with chesed because he understands that Ruth has behaved with chesed. And as Ira puts in the chat, Boaz believes kindness is important. And I agree with you there, Ira. But I would suggest possibly that what we're reading here is not so much the result of Boaz's own internal beliefs, but rather of Boaz being inspired by Ruth's kindness to be kind himself. I think that it's a statement of the power of kindness to breed kindness in those around us as well. And the proof for that, if I have proof, is in this verse right here. May God reward your deeds. May you have full recompense from the eternal, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have sought refuge. Let me show you one commentary, and then we'll stop and take your thoughts as well. This is from the Jewish Study Bible as well, where it says that this verse, the verse we just read about having full recompense for your kindness, summarizes the message of the book. Whoever seeks shelter with the God of Israel will be rewarded. Rabbinic interpreters understand this phrase as a reference to Ruth's conversion. And I think that that is a reading of the verse, that if you find your way under the wings of God, then you will, then may you have a full recompense, may you have a full reward for your actions. But notice, actually, look at the beginning of that verse. This is actually about her kindness. Boaz is saying to her, may you experience kindness because of your kindness. And this is it's a Hasidic text, Rabbi Mordechai Yaffe, who says that this, in Leviticus, it talks about Shavuot, and then immediately afterwards it says, when you reap the harvest of the land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of the field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. This is what Boaz has fulfilled, and so we read Ruth on Shavuot. In other words, that the operative act here is the act of kindness that Boaz performs, and Boaz is responding in turn to the act of kindness that Ruth had performed earlier. So Joy and Peter, go ahead, and then happy to have any other reactions as well.
There's an ongoing theme in Torah of what you do, what goes around comes around, and there's a Hebrew for that. I can't remember it, but if you look at Jacob, the trickster, Joseph the trickster. Everything comes back to you get your just desserts. And just one example of that is Joseph tricks his brothers, and then in the end, his brothers come back and all is well again. So, and Jacob tricks Isaac, and then and then he in the end is tricked by marrying Leah. So there's that theme it runs all the way through Tanakh, and I think it's here as well.
Yeah,
Ruth is kind and is repaid. Ruth is kind to Naomi, and Boaz repays that by being kind to Ruth.
Great. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that is an element of Torah. This, what goes around comes around. In other cultures you call it karma. We don't call it that in Judaism. But I think there's another element that Torah also recognizes, the ability of people to grow. So there's two elements together here. One is what you put out into the universe affects what you receive from the universe. Jacob the trickster gets tricked right back. Ruth the Hasidah, Ruth the person of loving kindness, receives loving kindness back. But also on top of that, we as human beings have the ability to grow. And if we grow toward chesed, which the rabbis believe is the purpose of Torah, to help us grow toward chesed, then we have the ability to build a world of chesed, as they, the famous passage, which I think is Hasidic, goes, Olam chesed yibaneh. We can build a world from chesed. In fact, take a look here at this commentary from the Midrash Lekach Tov, where it asks the same question we keep asking: why is Ruth read on Shavuot? Since this Megillah, this scroll, is all chesed, and the Torah is all chesed, as it is said, the law of kindness, Torah chesed al lishonah, the law of kindness is on her tongue. Her here being Torah, that Torah teaches us kindness. And the Torah was given on the holiday of Shavuot. So they're suggesting that we read Ruth on Shavuot because of the loving kindness that sits at the center of it, and because Torah is ultimately meant to lead us toward chesed. Ira, go ahead.
I was going to say there's sort of a macro perspective to this too, because on a personal level, if you, I don't know, karma or what you were just talking about, but what about the people as a whole? Because, in the Torah, there's the blessings and the curses that says, if you follow my commandments, things will go well for you as a whole. So I think that there's that aspect to it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. It's interesting that Ruth is really taking place on the very micro level, right? Where Deuteronomy deals with, if you follow my laws, all of you, I'm from Louisiana, I would say if y'all follow my laws, then y'all will be fine. Ruth says this is happening on the micro interpersonal level, on the level of how individual people treat each other and whether we are able to see the humanity in our fellow human beings. It's a very important message for all times, but maybe for our time more than ever, because between social media and news media, we have this incredible ability to dehumanize the other. And I was at a session on Shavuot, Erev Shavuot. I went to this all-night study session. I made it till 1 a.m. I didn't make it all night, but at any rate, one of the sessions I went to was about is Jewish-Palestinian dialogue, and the central message there was that these things are very hard to solve, but that the first step is humanizing the other, understanding that the person on the other side of the border is a human being, and that the ways they act that you don't understand are the result of some human experience. And Ruth, in theory, is supposed to be the enemy of the Israelites. Moabites are enemies of the Israelites, and I think that this book does that on purpose. It places the enemy into the role of the human being, and it shows that when we humanize each other, then we are more capable of acting with chesed, so that maybe the geopolitical is solved, or at least we begin to take steps towards solving it on the micro level. Daniel, go ahead, and then I think we'll close up with a last text or two.
Yeah, I also wanted to add on to the 7 Minute Torah episode that you put on about the 70 faces of Torah, where it's also said that there's not only one way of living out the laws of Torah. And there was also, I think, the chesed is the major point, that because of the kindness, that the one, I don't remember now exactly, but the one leader or the one teacher had the right, or had the authority to interpret his way of Torah just because of the kindness. And I think not only that shows the point that you were right now making, what is the core of the Ruth story. I think also that the many ways of interpreting Judaism is also on the soil of the many ways of sharing the chesed in the world. Everyone has his own way of expressing that, as we're individuals, as you said, that we are humans with different experiences. And I think that's the beauty of the two stories now combined, of the Torah portion and now of the Ruth portion, that through the diversity of the chesed is also the diversity of Judaism and how to live it out. And I think that combines it really well. And
Yes.
Yeah, that
I
just
love
made
it.
it known. I might.
Yeah, thank you for that, Daniel. The text here that you're citing, which actually Bob just put this in the chat also, is from the Talmud. I'm pretty sure it's Tractate Eruvin. Is that story of Hillel and Shammai, or actually Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai?
True. Nah, yeah. The Torah portion was about the Mishkan still, of the Book of Numbers. Now this was your opener in the episode. Yeah, exactly. This was in the Talmud.
That's exactly right. Yeah, so for those who don't know the story, in really, really brief, and then we're going to turn to a closing text here. The story is that the students of Hillel and the students of Shammai are disagreeing for 3 years over, a matter of Jewish law. And finally, a voice from heaven comes and calls out, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim hem. These and those are the words of the living God. In other words, they're both right. But the halacha follows Hillel. So how is it possible that they're both right, but also the halacha follows Hillel? And the Talmud goes on to say it's because they were kind, they acted with chesed. I don't remember if the word is chesed or not there, but they essentially were kind and to others, and they quoted Shammai's teachings first. So they didn't just try to argue down the other guy. They quoted theirs first, they engaged and they listened, right? So that the rightness of Hillel's opinions is not based on his ability to shout louder or to reason better. It's based on his ability to listen and to see the humanity in the other. So it's a great dovetail with what we're talking about here. Let me turn to one last text. This is Rabbi Shai Held in his brand new book called Judaism is About Love, which is very much worth a read. And I would read this whole paragraph to you if we had time, but I won't. So we'll just read I'm just going to read the bottom text. He essentially argues that there are two. Well, he wants to make 2 points here, of which the first one is about chesed. That we read this book because of chesed. Reading Ruth on Shavuot, he says, we are reminded through powerful example about the kind of life Torah intends for us to live. Lives animated by love, manifested in concrete acts of kindness and generosity. Second here, and I found this very moving. The book of Ruth opens by situating the story in dark times, in the days when the chieftains or judges ruled. We talked before about that as a time of chaos. The time of the biblical chieftains was a time of moral decay and social unraveling. Unrestrained by fear of God or legal authorities, people did whatever they pleased. Ruth's story reminds us that we are capable of deep, transformative love, even and sometimes especially in the grimmest times and bleakest of places. So I think ultimately, where is the tikva found in the book of Ruth? Where is the hope found in the book of Ruth? It's in the fact that Ruth believes that it is possible to transform the world around you through chesed, through the humanizing of the other, through sharing deep caring about the other. It is possible to bring redemption into the world. And in the case of Ruth, that redemption is found in this micro way of Ruth and Naomi finding a place in a family and a life and happiness in which they can live. But in a much broader sense, we're taught through this book of Ruth that redemption comes into the world through chesed. And in fact, Ruth is understood to be the great-grandmother of King David. And King David is, of course, the progenitor of the Messiah. So it is because of Ruth that the messianic redemption can come into the world. Traditional Jews, Orthodox Jews, understand that as a literal Messiah. We liberal Jews understand it as a messianic age, a redemption that we are charged with bringing into the world. And Ruth, I think, is the symbol of and the archetype for how we can bring redemption into the world by humanizing others and by acting with chesed and loving kindness. So I want to thank you all for spending an hour of study with me. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned a little something. I certainly did. And I wish you all a Chag Shavuot Sameach, a very happy rest of this second day of Shavuot. Take care, everyone.